Hey everybody. Let me get it back here a little bit. First time camera setup in this room, so you're just all gonna have to bear with me a little bit. Hello to everybody in Instagram world. So glad you could join us for this special takeover event. For those of you joining us on YouTube and Twitch, don't worry, haven't forgotten about you guys either. You're right in front. 1 second. Apparently on the Instagram feed right now, everybody's getting a black screen. No?
It's good.
Oh, never mind. It's all set. All right. Now that we've got some of the technical bugs out of the way, so we've got a little bit of a different show for you guys today. Usually we do a meal prep in where we prepare food live for you guys, let you do a little bit of Q&A. This week, Victoria and Danielle are off snowboarding and having a great time because not only is your nutritional health and your physical health important, but your mental health is also very important as well. And you need to take days off from time to make sure you can do some activities that you really enjoy. So what I'm going to do for you today is we're going to talk about a topic that's very near and dear to me. I encounter this a lot with the population that I work with, and I call it the office worker's plight. But realistically, this is something that affects anybody that has to spend an extended period of time sitting. So this isn't just for people who sit in offices all day, but people who have to drive a lot for work as well are definitely affected by this as well. So let's get down to business. This is the usual position that you will find an office worker in. Sitting down at their desk, looking up at their monitor. Clack, 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 clackety, clack, 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 clack. Now, the things that I want to point out here is when we're in this position right here, our hip flexor muscle is in a constantly flexed state. So if we're sitting like this for 3 to 4 hours before we get up to take our first break, oh man, wow, that's so tight. Oh, gotta pull it back up straight before we can head off and do our thing. But here's the thing. If over time, day after day, you spend more and more time in that constantly flexed state, this muscle is going to start to shorten itself. And all of a sudden, when you want to pull it to full extension, you're not going to be able to get that anymore. Because your central nervous system has now taken over, and it's decided that since this muscle spends so much time in this contracted state, that this is the safe, healthy range of motion. But we know that is absolute crap. So some of the things that people who sit a lot and have tight hip flexors will end up experiencing is lower back pain as well as a weakness in their lower abdominal muscles. Now, where this kind of all ties together is if these muscles right here don't fire to control your torso's movement in and through your hips, these muscles right here start to do a lot of work that they're not actually designed to do. So in doing so, we stress them out, and that's where we get that nagging lower back pain for days and days that just ever seems to last. Now, some other things that we run into being an office worker or sitting a lot in a car, things of that nature, it all has to do with how we hold our posture. There isn't necessarily anything wrong with your posture in general, but the worst posture for you is the one that you spend too much time in. So you definitely want to be moving around and changing things up. But if you're always like this, looking up at your screen, well, we've got tight hip flexors, we've got stretched out hamstring muscles, we've got weak external rotators in our hips now. As well, we're starting to crush all of these muscles and all of these nerve endings coming right out of our cervical spine just to look up at our monitor. So what happens is everything starts to rise up, and we end up in this very tightened state up here, through here, and just trying to stand up and straighten your body out just doesn't work for you anymore. So how do we fix this? How do we solve these problems? How do we get it so that way we don't have to deal with that nagging lower back pain anymore? How do we open our hip flexors and strengthen everything up? Well, I'm going to show you just that. So what I like to start with is a handy dandy foam roller. This one is very compact, easy to travel with, great for vacations, and for those of you who do races, if you have to travel a lot to get to those places, This thing can save your life. So we're going to start by opening up this hip flexor muscle and just trying to take out some of the knots and tension that we've built up over time. Now, for those of you on Instagram, I'm actually going to have to tilt my phone just a little bit so you can see this a little better. Those of you who are watching on Facebook and YouTube and Twitch, you'll see that I've got a second camera set up which will be pointed directly at where I'm going to be working. Just give me just 1 second here. There we go. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to position ourselves so we can put the majority of our body weight on the hip flexor, on the foam roller. Now, a lot of times when you're trying to foam roll, people will get very lazy with their posture. And if you start to rest and relax your shoulders up into your neck, you're actually going to create a whole nother host of issues for yourself while you're trying to fix other said issues. So what I want you to think when you're foam rolling is try to get yourself into a good, strong plank position. Push your arms deep down into the earth and make sure your shoulders are wrapping nicely around your rib cage. So we've got that in position. Now we're going to balance as much of our body weight as we can stand on that hip flexor. So we're just going to roll up and down a little bit. We're going to try and find those spots that are nice and tight. As soon as we hit a nice tight spot, we're going to pause and stop on it. And what we're going to do next is a technique called flossing. We're now going to try to contract and move that muscle through that tension point. If you find yourself catching a knot in a good spot, you can kind of move into it a little bit as you're flexing and just work it down the leg. Now, a lot of times when people are foam rolling, I see this in the gym. This is a waste of time. This isn't doing much of anything. The idea is we're trying to push and pull knots out of the muscle tissue. So think of it from this perspective. Your muscle strands are surrounded by a tissue called fascia. So you've got your muscle strand and you've got the fascia right on top of it. So what ends up happening is as these muscles sit in contracted states or overly elongated states, or as they kind of contract and extend, we start to get knots or impurities that will form in the fascia around that muscle tissue. So what we do with our foam roller is we apply pressure to the knot and the muscle tissue, and then we extend the muscle again, pulling that fascia nice and flat over the muscle fiber. So if you're just kind of cruising over that foam roller, you're not doing anything for yourself. You've got to get on the knot, you've got to push it out, you've got to work it out. Nice small motions. So again, we get back into that position. We're in a good strong plank, lots of weight down on that hip flexor, and we're just trying to work those knots out, working down the leg. Now another thing you can do to try and hit more surface area of your hip flexor is when you get to a particularly tight or tender area, you can internally and externally rotate your leg to work the tissue as it wraps around the leg. So for instance, I'm hitting a really good one as I get towards the outside of my leg. It's probably a little bit closer to my IT band. Everybody's got tight IT bands. And we'll just start to work that out a little bit as we run down the outside portion of the leg. Woo, there we go. So now we've worked some knots out. We've softened up that muscle tissue. Now's a good time to actually stretch it out. So my favorite stretch is called the Arthur. This is a little bit of an advanced stretch, so if you do have tight hip flexors, this probably isn't going to be the stretch that you want to start with as you're trying to open yourself up. But this is where I'm going to start, I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to show you how to modify it so that way you can make it work for you a little bit better. So we want to get ourselves a wall surface that we can put our foot up against and maintain a nice lunge position down at the floor. So because I actually have some pretty good flexibility, I'm going to get my knee really close to the wall. And what happens is, when we set ourselves up into this position, now we can stretch and pull those hip flexor muscles. Now as you can see, there's probably, you'll be able to see why you probably can't get into this position if you already have pretty tight hip flexor muscles. So what you want to end up doing is start your knee further away from the wall. So now I've got like a foot gap. And this is going to make it a little bit easier because I'm not as quite aggressive on the angle that my hip's at. So if you find a good one that you can do the Arthur in, the next step is to activate the hips and the glutes and to just kind of push those hips into that stretch, not trying to lean any particular way because again, you're trying to stretch those hip flexor muscles deep inside the upper part of your leg. You're going to hold that for about 35, 40 seconds. You can tense up the muscle tissue around it, really kind of push into it. Let the central nervous system relax. You'll know you've released it when you start to feel like a warming, melting sensation go through the muscle. At least that's how I describe it. Ooh. All right. So what do we do if we can't start with the Arthur and if we can't start with the modified Arthur? Well, we can do just a simple lunge stretch. It's simple because there's not much to it and it works. We get into our lunge position. We follow the same principles where we want to tighten up the glutes and the hips and we want to start pushing forward into that, trying to lengthen out the muscles here. This is the focus of the stretch. Tighten up the body, tighten up the core, push the hips forward, increase that hip angle. You can also torque your hips a little bit internally if you're having trouble really getting into that stretch. If you're just not feeling it and you've got a pretty deep angle going back, you're probably ready to move on to something like the Arthur. All right, so that's going to wrap us up for our hip flexors. Anybody have any questions on any of that as we've been moving forward? I do have my lovely fiance here helping me out. So if you have any questions on the Instagram or if you've got any questions while you're watching us on YouTube or Twitch, we definitely will be able to answer as we go. So feel free to ask. Okay, so we talked about how keeping a muscle in a contracted state will start to make it not as usable as we want it to be. So what happens to the things like our hamstring muscles that are in that constantly elongated state? Well, now those are going to have a tough time coming back into a contracted state, which means you're actually going to lose a lot of power there. If we lose power in the hamstrings, we lose power in the posterior chain, well, that weight's got to go somewhere when we start doing things to try and move around. And chances are, again, it's going to be the lower back. Those lower back muscles, they always want to help. They're not supposed to, but they want to help. They're team players. That's really what it boils down to. So to kind of help out with the hamstrings, you want to do the opposite of stretching them out because they're already in that stretch state all freaking day. So you want to find some exercises that are going to target that posterior chain a little bit more directly. So what I do for those is I like to start with some hip raises. Really great for the glute muscles and really great for getting just that posterior chain starting to fire up. Draw that energy into the core. Make sure the torso is one unit. Try not to let your spine flex and bend because that's going to take away from the actual driving force. Focus on what you're doing. Concentrate on those posterior muscles. Drive through the glutes and the hamstrings. You can do these in a couple different ways. You can start with isometric holds. Very simple. You're just holding tension on the muscle tissue. Or you can try to go through repetitions. But again, you want to keep your torso as one unit. Try not to flex and bend your spine as you move through, and you'll absolutely feel those glute and hamstring muscles fire up a little bit more. If you're having trouble feeling the glutes, you may be pressing into your toes. So what I typically do for people in that situation is I just have them tilt their toes up to get a little bit more drive from those heels. I wouldn't recommend doing them like this exclusively because you do want to get yourself into the habit of trying to build even pressure throughout your foot. Even pressure on the heel, even pressure on the pad of the foot. But again, if you're having trouble getting that glute activation, you can help yourself by doing that toe tilt up. Now, the closer your heels are to your butt, the more you're going to feel those glute muscles. So, if we need to get those hamstring muscles working a little bit more, we just move the legs further away. Now what happens is the tension and the effort's going to be more on those hamstrings. Again, you can do isometric holds, or you can work yourself through repetitions. If you're an avid gym goer and you're trying to develop those glute muscles in that posterior chain, you can also do what's called the hip thrust exercise with a barbell across your waist. That one works really well if you've already got the fundamental basics of the movement down. So unfortunately, if your central nervous system is already having a difficult time firing those muscles up, if you just start loading weight on it, your body's going to find other ways to produce that effort. So, as crazy as it sounds, a lot of times you almost have to regress yourself to the simplest form of the exercise and just take a step outside of your ego. Don't worry about what kind of weight you're lifting. Just focus on that muscular activation. Do you feel it? Can you feel your glute muscles firing? Can you feel your hamstring muscles firing? You're going to get more out of a workout centered around feeling muscle activation than you're going to get off throwing weight on a bar and just trying to plow your way through a workout. The human body is an amazing machine, and it is always going to find the path of least resistance. And if that happens to be an improper movement pattern, well, guess what? You're going to work in an improper movement pattern, and you're going to set yourself up for an injury somewhere down the road. Be it no activation in the glutes or the hamstrings, so when you're deadlifting, you're just wrenching a lot of that weight up with your back muscles. I mean, that's great for building up the back, but it's terrible for those lower back muscles. It's going to end up leading to a spinal injury. So we want to avoid that. We want to make sure we've got good, proper muscle activation. But let's get back to the topic at hand, because we're really mostly focused on people who sit a lot for their day jobs. We talked about our hip flexors getting really tight and contracted. We talked about the hamstring muscles getting really lengthened and loose and just not being able to work quite as well as we want them to. So what else ends up happening? Well, these hip muscles that are responsible for your internal and external rotation, they can also get pretty messed up from sitting for long periods of time, depending on where you tend to shift your weight. This can also be said about when you're standing in line. So, as a little experiment, the next time you're waiting in a line or a queue at the grocery store or for a payphone, because everybody's still using payphones, I want you to try and catch yourself and figure out, are you standing with good even pressure spread across both feet, or do you find yourself leaning and shifting your weight onto one hip? Chances are you probably dominantly move to one hip, which means that hip is going to be a lot tighter than the other one because you're spending more time having it in contraction. So a good test for this, you can take a seat right on your chair and very simply elevate the leg, and without moving the upper portion, see if you can generate a good strong hold through both rotation points. This is a very weak hip muscle. Ouch. So that tells me I want to work on this a little bit. And I was feeling a little bit of a pinching sensation, which tells me there's probably some muscles in there that are a little bit knotted up. Well, it's a good thing we've got some more handy-dandy tools for working on that. We can use the foam roller to hit our hips. We can use a racquetball. We can use a lacrosse ball. We could even use a golf ball or an 8-ball or a pool ball. But out of all the tools that you could use, the foam roller, the racquetball, and the lacrosse ball are my go-to and my preferred methods and what I'd recommend. Always start with the softer material if you're not used to rolling a particular area, because especially those smaller areas that you're going to put a lot of weight down on, you can absolutely cause yourself some damage if you're not used to it and not used to the sensation. So, for the sake of this, I'm going to skip over the lighter implements and go right for the lacrosse ball because I've already done this a bunch of times. I know my hip. I know where I want this ball to go. It's a very small area that we're going to be working, but if you flex the leg up, you will kind of feel it. All right? It's going to be starting where the glute muscles form all around in that hip area. But what we're trying to avoid is we don't want to roll right over the bones or the joints where everything kind of connects, because that's just a good way to pinch stuff and make yourself miserable. So we'll get a good position on the floor. We're going to cross the leg over that we're trying to work on, and we're going to get the ball and just kind of position it right in that soft, squishy spot of the hip that sits just behind where your leg bone orients with your pelvis. Now, we're not going to do too much other than just roll in some small circles and try and find those points of tightness and where the muscles don't seem like they want to just give. Once you find one, there it is. Now comes the fun part. Again, make sure when you're doing exercises like this, you're pushing your hands down into the earth. You don't want to be resting up in your neck. Now that we've found the spot, we're going to let our body weight just kind of sink into it. And we're just going to do as much as we can stand. Now again, I've beaten the crap out of myself over and over again. So I can just kind of let all my weight drop onto this ball and it does not bother me. If this is your first time, your second, or your third time, go slow. Use less body weight than you think you need to. Because I promise you, the last thing you want to do is really get yourself hurting. But even just sitting right in this position, I haven't even been moving much. I can already feel those muscles starting to loosen up as the central nervous system is relaxing and letting go tension. Now, if we want to expedite this process and kind of see how it's going to work with movement, what we can do is we can tighten up the hips and we can try to flex our knee away from our body. I say flex your knee. Don't actually try to move the knee. Try to move the knee with the lower muscles in the leg, or the higher muscles in the leg, depending on where you're oriented. All those muscles that are up by your hip. And as we start to flex and move those, it's going to open up that path of travel to how things are supposed to rotate, and then you can work on those knots a little bit better. So much relief. Whew. All right. Now that we've loosened that up a bit, the next thing we're going to be doing is I want to show you some stretches you can do for those hip muscles. First one you can start with, really simple, really easy. I'm going to move my microphone clip for a second because I'm going to be laying down on my back. We're going to start with a stretch called the figure four. Now, where I see a lot of people go wrong with the figure four, let's make sure I'm in the shot, is when they situate themselves for the figure four, they try to crank back on everything and they end up pulling, again, everything up into their neck, and we don't want that. So we're going to reach through and around, just so that way we can get a good solid lock. We're going to pull our shoulders and our back down into the earth. We're going to relax our head and our neck. And if you pull in towards your body. Don't try to pull up towards your head. Now, once all this is good and situated, if I want to get a deeper stretch, what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to activate that hip, and I'm going to try to rotate the leg away from my body to get deeper into that stretch. Can hold it for bouts of 5 seconds. Relax. Now, if you find the figure four is just not for you, you can upgrade that exercise a little bit with the pigeon stretch. So a lot of people, when they're trying to situate themselves for the pigeon stretch, is they just set it up and try to drop into it. Now, the problem with that is a lot of times you'll feel this straining sensation around the knee. If you're doing a pigeon stretch and you feel a straining sensation around your knee, guess what? You're not stretching your hip. You're actually stretching the knee joint, which isn't inherently bad. It is good to have slightly flexible joints, but not in an extreme compromised angle like that. You don't want to try and stretch your knee joint like that. So if you feel that knee tension in the pigeon, you have to readjust yourself, or you're setting yourself up for something bad down the road. So what I like to do is I start from the quadruped position, and I just bring one leg back, the other leg forward, and once I've got a good solid stacking position, my heel's pretty much right in front of my other leg, I'm going to start to just reach my other leg back, crawling across the floor, trying to drop the hip and keep the tension in the hip down towards the floor. Keeps all the tension out of that knee and allows me to drop my hip deep into a nice pigeon stretch. All right. So that wraps us up pretty much for everything that we have to deal with around the hips. Now, I know this specific show is geared towards those who sit a lot and whatnot, but everything that we've covered today, it's good for everybody. I mean, I don't care where you're at in your athletic journey. All these stretches are really good if you find that you have chronic tightness or chronic weaknesses in any of those areas. So the one last thing we're going to cover that is specifically related to office workers, drivers, and people who work their grip in the gym is we're going to talk a little bit about the forearm muscles, specifically the brachioradialis. Now, if you've never tried to loosen this muscle, you are in for a treat because it is one of the most painful things in the world, and you probably would have never realized just how tight that muscle was. But when we go back to our example of the office worker and we see them clacking away at their desk, what ends up happening is we float this arm a lot. And if you're right-hand dominant, you'll probably feel this a lot more in your right. If you're left-hand dominant, probably the left. When we're mousing, we tend to keep an amount of tension in the hand and the wrist. Well, the forearm is directly responsible for most of the movement and motions that happens in your fingers and your wrist. So what we're going to do is we're going to locate this brachioradialis right. Actually, that'll probably be a little bit easier without the sleeve. Oh, of course, this is the tattooed arm, so we'll see what we can see, right? So we've got our joint right where the elbow is, and then we've got the meat of the forearm. There's going to be two major hemispheres that you'll be able to feel. You're looking to get your thumb kind of right in between those two major hemispheres. There it is. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make a nice tight fist. And as soon as you do that, if you're on that muscle, you should feel a little bit of tension underneath that thumb. It may be painful, it may not be painful. It depends on how everything is for you. Now from there, we're going to hold that tension with the thumb, and we're going to point our fist down, and we're going to point our fist up. If you find that you haven't been able to find it, or you did that and it really didn't feel like anything, play around a little bit. Explore your forearm muscles. See if you can find any tight points that need to get a little bit of tension released. So for anybody who's in the gym and you feel like your grip strength, especially for your deadlift or your hanging exercises, just isn't seeming to develop even though you're doing specific work for it, you may have some knots and some tension locked up in your forearm muscles. And simply by massaging and working that tissue, you can unlock a whole world of strength in your grip that you never even knew you had. And then for people who aren't necessarily working their grip, the office workers, you'll start to set yourself up so that way you won't end up with tennis elbow somewhere down the road. So that's another good thing to take into account. If you've got that pain that kind of radiates around the elbow, wraps through your tricep, down through the forearm, you may have some tension points in there that after you work out and release, all that pain will pretty much go away. It's amazing what you can accomplish and how you can make your body feel with targeted trigger point therapy. And what targeted trigger point therapy is just finding those impurities or knots or areas in the muscle tissue where it's not really contracting and extending the way you want it to because the fascia's gotten a little bunched up. You can change the entire way your body moves. Here's a prime example. Let's say you've got a lot of trouble with overhead extension because as soon as you get to this point, your shoulders just rotate out and up into your neck muscles. Well, chances are you've probably got some tension in the lower lats, your subscapulars, maybe even your triceps that are preventing that rotation of the shoulder blades around the rib cage. Once you open that up and allow your body to move the way it's supposed to, you'll probably feel muscles that have never worked before starting to work. So once we open up that movement for overhead, that's going to allow our serratus muscles to actually do their job and pull the shoulder blade around and up the rib cage. But if it's limited on motion and the shoulder can never get into position for the serratus to pull, well, guess what? these muscles are never going to work. They're going to be underdeveloped, and you're going to end up with a lot of shoulder issues and injuries as you try to press. So the biggest takeaway that I want everybody to take from this show today, not just our office workers and people who sit a lot for driving and whatnot, is always make mobility a priority. Opening everything up, being more mobile, will make you a better athlete. It'll make you move better as a human being, and chances are it will absolutely help with any nagging aches and pains that you've been living with your entire life. So, please, educate yourself on mobility, or come talk to me, and I'll educate you on mobility. Other than that, that's going to wrap our show up for today. I am going to open up the floor for some Q&A, though, for anybody who might have some questions on anything that we've covered, fitness, nutrition. I'll give you guys a couple minutes just in case we got something going on. So I think our Instagram feed's on something like an 8-second delay, somewhere around there. So I'll give you guys a minute. Other than that, I hope you all enjoyed the show. If you didn't get a chance to catch all of it, you can absolutely head on over to our Twitch channel or our YouTube channel. You will be able to see replays at your leisure, so you don't need to feel like you're rushing anything. Also, quick announcement, our Sunday Fun Day coupon, we are going to be continuing it on for a while, so if you were interested in hopping into any of our challenges, any of our courses that we offer, you can use that Sunday Fun Day coupon for $20 discount. Excellent show. Thank you. Thank you very much, RMB 1925. We appreciate your patronage and for hanging out with us today. Oh, you're welcome, Victoria. Thank you very much for tuning in. I know you guys are out having a great time. I appreciate you taking the time, though, to catch the show. That means a lot. Oh, does Odie want to sit? Have you guys met Odie? Hey, come here. Oh, you're gonna be camera shy now? Come here. Come here, bring me that ball. Oh, there he is. There's my handsome boy. Oh, he's got the butt wiggle going on too. Oh. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Have a wonderful Sunday, and we'll catch you next week. That's our show.